I remember there was one professor at London University that I liked very much. I would go to his classes and admired him. Very knowledgeable. And one day we arrived on a Monday morning and we were told that he had just committed suicide. And that shook me inside. And I realized that certainly these people that I had looked to for an answer didn't have it either. And so my depression intensified, and I did very well in the degree examinations because I studied so hard, out of fear really. I was driven by anxiety. And then after graduating from London University, I didn't do anything for about a year, and that was the year in which I became even more unhappy and depressed, and when an inner shift suddenly happened inside me. It was in my 29th year. I woke up in the middle of the night, and this was not uncommon for me, waking up in the middle of the night and feeling intensely depressed and in a state of great fear at the same time. And that happened again that night, and the thought occurred to me, I can't live with myself any longer. And that thought repeated itself in my mind. I can't live with myself. And then suddenly I looked at the thought. I kind of stood back from that thought and looked at it and said, that's a strange thought. I cannot live with myself. Am I one or am I two? This thought seems to show that there's two people here. I and the self that I cannot live with. I didn't have an answer to that question. It's just that question, that puzzle arose in my mind. Much later, it reminded me of a koans that they have in Zen, that are puzzles that are designed to stop the mind. For example, what is the sound of one hand clapping is a famous koan. And it doesn't have an answer on an intellectual level. And so the question that arose in my mind also didn't have an answer on an intellectual level. Who am I and who is myself that I cannot live with? But that question triggered an inner shift. Something inside me, and I didn't understand it at that point, must have disidentified from the self, the unhappy me, as I later called it. So a kind of an inner disidentification happened. The I am, which I later recognized as the consciousness that I am, separated itself from the conditioned entity, the conditioned consciousness that provided me with my sense of identity, the self. And that consisted largely of an unhappy story. So then I felt I was like being drawn into some kind of vortex of energy, as if I were disappearing in that. And there was still a moment of resistance. And I heard something almost like a voice inside me that said, resist nothing. So I gave up resisting the feeling of disappearing into nothingness. And so that, don't remember very much else of that night. All I know is that the next morning I woke up and I opened my eyes and I looked around the room, and everything seemed as if I was seeing it for the first time. Fresh, new, alive. The light coming through the windows, familiar objects on the table. They looked fresh, new and alive. So I got up and went out for a walk, and I looked around, and everything seemed so peaceful. Even the traffic in the city seemed so peaceful, and I knew something strange had happened. There was suddenly, everything was filled with aliveness and peace, and I didn't know why. And that went on, and then this inner peace as the background to all experiences and the background to all sense perceptions, even as the background to my thinking, that then never really left me again. But it took me a long time to understand it, to be able to put it into words. And so a little later I started investigating other spiritual teachings, for the first time Buddhism, Christianity, and more contemporary spiritual teachings. And very quickly I recognized the truth that is in many cases hiding underneath sometimes centuries of cultural additions, interpretations and misinterpretations. And I could see the truth that's in Buddhism, that's in Christianity, the original teachings. And in turn, they shed light on what had happened to me. For example, I picked up the New Testament and I read Jesus' words, "The peace that passes all understanding." I said, that's exactly what I feel. I have this peace and I don't understand what it is. So he must have had the same experience. Peace suddenly arose, which was not causally related to anything in the external world. It wasn't caused by something wonderful happening in my external environment. So it didn't seem to have a cause, an external cause. And then later I visited Zen teachers and so on, and again I recognized the truth of Zen immediately, but they also helped me to understand and put what had happened to me into a wider context. For example, I remember talking to one Buddhist monk who said, who talked about coming to the end of always having to thinking. And he said, Zen is about not thinking, ultimately. And I immediately realized something that I actually, strangely, I hadn't realized before, that my thought processes, ever since that happened that night, had become reduced by maybe 80%. So I wasn't actually thinking that much anymore. And that's why there was so much peace. So I realized the continuous mental noise, as I now call it, which is the compulsive and largely useless thinking that most people are continuously engaged in, that had come to an end. There would still be some thought, and I could use thinking when I needed it, and occasionally thoughts would come in and out, but there were huge stretches of no thought. And in those long gaps and intervals of no thought, there was that wonderful experience of inner peace. And I realized that inner peace had been there before, even when I was still anxious, but had simply been covered up by the anxiety, by the hyperactive mind. And so this then gradually developed into a spiritual teaching. So the spiritual teaching now attempts to show people that they have within themselves already what they may perhaps are looking for on the outside.